Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be back here at Hillsdale. I was last here 5 years ago, at which point I had just begun working on this book, which was published in June, but now available for all your e-media readers. I don't know how that got on there. That was a mistake. I swear it's a brand new lecture. So this is the table of contents of the book. And, oh, I mean to ask, how long do I have to speak?
All you want.
An hour is good, yeah.
Okay. An hour plus questions or an hour including questions?
Maybe 45 minutes plus questions.
Okay. Then I know how fast I have to talk. So this is the table of contents, and I'm going to skip the first 6 chapters because we only have limited time, and talk about the last half of the book, or the last 70 years, basically. Let's see if I can find the right button. There we go. So the first half of the book can be summarized as your essential compendium, your essential companion, key for decoding these famous rap videos. And the reason I want you to think of it that way is that these have about 3 million hits. So if everybody who watches them buys my book, you can do the math. But let's jump into it. During the Second World War, economies were centrally planned to organize the war effort, and a number of liberal, left-wing, socialist, self-described socialist politicians, especially in Great Britain, made the argument that, look, when it counts, we rely on strong central government to pull us through. Let's do that in peacetime too. Right? This cartoon is from the cartoon version of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which was a reaction to that kind of argument. But it summarizes it pretty fairly. That is what people were hearing from their radio. The UK Labour Party produced this quote in one of their pamphlets: "The main wartime controls in industry and agriculture should be maintained." As I said, Hayek wrote The Road to Serfdom kind of as a response to that. I mean, planning was in the air. Everybody was talking about planning. And he said, look, you ought to know what you're getting into. Central planning is not going to work in terms of getting the economy to produce more goods. And so you're going to meet with frustration. And if you decide to put the plan ahead of everything else, that means you're going to toss away civil liberties. You're going to have to restrict people's freedom of occupational choice, right? Everybody has to fit into a slot in your plan. And so you need to worry about those sort of things. And it would be very ironic if people with the best intentions who wanted to make the economy more prosperous adopted the wrong means and not only made the economy poorer, but made it much less free. He started out writing a pamphlet. It was actually addressed to the head of the LSE, a Fabian socialist economist named Beveridge, who had argued that the Nazi Party in Germany was a reaction against socialism and was the last-ditch defense of capitalism. And Hayek said, no, it's an outshoot of socialism. I mean, the name of the party is the the National Socialist Workers' Party. And they took the socialist part seriously. But it became a book. It was a bestseller. More importantly, in the US, it was condensed and put in Reader's Digest. Now, I don't know if you've seen Reader's Digest recently. It's kind of a joke. It's easy to overlook it at your dentist's office because it's about this big now. But back in the day, it was not only the most popular magazine in the United States, it sold 7 million copies. There's no magazine that comes close to that nowadays, but people had more limited options. So 7 million copies, had requests to reprint another 1 million copies, so it kind of made him a star. This is the most recent edition. Hayek came to the US and went on a lecture tour, and what he thought of as kind of an obscure book directed at a British audience, he was packing lecture halls across America. Hayek and Keynes were, of course, in the middle of a big debate over monetary policy, and Hayek was kind of diverting his attention from that to address the issue of central planning. And here is Keynes's response to the road to serfdom. It's a letter that Keynes wrote while he was on a transatlantic ocean liner, I'm not sure which one, Queen Mary or something like that, on his way to the Bretton Woods post-war monetary conference. He writes Hayek this letter, and a lot of people have quoted the first part. In fact, I think it's even on the back of the dust jacket of the book. In my opinion, it's a grand book, but you have to wait for the but. But what we want is not no planning, or even less planning. We almost certainly want more planning. It'll be safe if those carrying it out are rightly orientated in their own minds and hearts to your own moral position. We're all classical liberals here, those of us who are going to run the central plan. What are you worried about? Dangerous acts can be done safely in a community which thinks and feels rightly, which would be the way to hell if they were executed by those who think and feel wrongly. So, I mean, the reason that bad men have gotten on top in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, it's just bad luck. Right? If you get the right people in charge, it'll all work out, which suggests that Keynes didn't really read the book carefully. He skipped the chapter on why the worst get on top. Right? There's a selection mechanism in a totalitarian state. And the economist Frank Knight put it this way in a review of The Road to Serfdom. He said, the likelihood that somebody who respects civil liberties will get to the top in that kind of system is about on a par with the likelihood that a tender-hearted man would get the job of overseer on a slave plantation. Right? It's not selecting for that kind of person. And when there's a demand to get the plan to work, the person who's willing to put aside all kind of constraints, like letting people choose their own jobs, that would interfere with the plan, that kind of person is going to get to the top. Now, I was told that Winston Churchill is popular here, so I made sure I had a picture of Churchill. In the election campaign in 1945, after the war, Churchill is running for re-election against the Labour Party candidate Clement Attlee. And Churchill makes a reference to Hayek's book, and in the press it was regarded as a kind of clumsy reference. He said no socialist government could allow free, sharp, or violently worded expressions. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo. And the idea of a Gestapo in Great Britain was considered, that's beyond the pale, that's just crazy talk. And the next day, Attlee sort of pounced on this and called it a second-hand version of the academic views of an Austrian, and let's make him sound really strange, so let's use his middle name. Professor Friedrich August von Hayek, who is very popular just now and has supplied ideas to the Conservative Party. Hayek wasn't actually talking to the Conservative Party at this time, but somebody gave this idea to Churchill. Churchill put it in a speech, but it didn't help him, didn't help Churchill in the election. Attlee swept into a big victory. So the view seemed to have been, yeah, Churchill got us through the war, that's fine, but now we need to plan the peace. And Attlee's the man for that. The Labour Party are the people for that. So Attlee is the candidate, but the chairman of the Labour Party is a socialist intellectual named Harold Lasky. Lasky taught at the London School of Economics and actually had an office just a few doors down from Hayek's. Hayek taught economics at the London School. Lasky taught political science. Now, during the campaign, Lasky went around giving speeches talking about what a great experiment is going on in the Soviet Union, and even had nice things to say about Stalin. And this didn't play so well. And Attlee sent Lasky a note privately, which later became public and has become famous. He said, a period of silence from you would be appreciated. Then after the election, Attlee had a press conference in which he said, look, I want to make it clear that I'm going to be running things, not Professor Lasky. And a reporter from the New York Times was at this press conference, and they published a story the next day with one of my favorite headlines of all time, Britain not ruled by intellectuals. Right, so Lasky was a leading light in what was called the Fabian Society. The Fabian Society was an organization that had been agitating for piecemeal socialist measures. They weren't Marxist revolutionaries. They were Fabians, meaning gradualists. Anybody study Roman military history? You know Quintus Fabius Maximus? No? Kind of liberal education. He was the general whose tactic was against the Hannibal's elephants, delay, delay, delay. So gradualism. Don't have any one big battle. And so the Fabian socialists, we're not looking for a revolution. We're going to introduce piecemeal measures. So that's who the Fabians are. Their influence is strong. 200 members of the Labor Party who were elected to Parliament were members of the Fabian Society. But Lasky was going to be shunted aside. But this is the way it was described. Victory is at the polls for British socialism. That's how they described themselves. And by socialism, they meant what socialism meant to just about everybody in those days. It meant government ownership of the means of production. Right? So it wasn't about egalitarianism. It wasn't about the welfare state. It was about who owns the factories. Right? And that's the standard definition of socialism that was the subject of the famous socialist calculation debate, where the Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Hayek said, can't work. Right? A rational socialist economy, because you centralize ownership and you don't have markets, you don't have competitive markets for machines and factories and plots of land and bidding for labor, doesn't allocate things in an efficient way, you're at sea without a compass. So what did the Labor Party do when they got into power? Well, they continued rationing. They didn't call it rationing, they called it fair shares. But in some cases, I guess they admitted it. But I love this poster because if you actually count the number of packages of meat, they've gone up with rationing. Not quite sure how that works. But see, the one lady isn't able to buy up all the meat. But she's apparently happy to get one piece of meat in a ration bar. They nationalized some of the largest industries. The Bank of England, well, it was already doing what the government wanted, so that didn't really matter. But transportation, coal, cable and wireless, gas and electric, steel, together the industries they nationalized employed about 20% of the workforce. So it wasn't 100% yet, but it was a big step. And it was a step that pointed in the direction of government playing a bigger and bigger role in the economy. Their macroeconomic policy was Keynesian, and that was actually a relief, because there were some who didn't want macroeconomic policy in a just sort of aggregate way. They wanted detailed central planning, and that never quite happened. But there was a battle within the Attlee government between James Meade, he was the leader of the Keynesian group, or as they called themselves, the thermostaters, because they thought, you know, macroeconomic policy is like operating a thermostat. The economy gets too hot, then you cool it down. If it gets too cold, you warm it up. The opposing group, who seriously wanted central planning, called themselves, somewhat ironically, I hope, they called themselves the Gosplanners. The Gosplan was the Soviet Union's central planning agency. So this is part of the reason Attlee was sensitive about Lasky praising Stalin and the Soviet system, because there were people in his party who wanted to implement that, and he didn't, so he wanted to keep that a little quiet. But this, by the way, is Meade standing in front of a hydraulic model of the Keynesian system. Somebody actually built one where there are actual flows, a circular flow, literally a circular flow, and leakages and injections, and you could see how the economy responded to changes. That was science, I don't know. So behind the Fabian Society, going back to the late 1800s, were three principal figures, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, they were married, and George Bernard Shaw. Now, if you've heard of George Bernard Shaw, it's probably as a playwright. He wrote Pygmalion, some other famous plays. But he actually wrote more words as a socialist pamphleteer than he ever wrote in his plays. He considered himself an amateur economist. Well, he actually considered himself a fairly well-trained amateur economist. he carried on a correspondence with Keynes. And this was the book published in 1892 or something around there that sort of made the first big splash for the society, Fabian Essays on Socialism. And over the years, they published hundreds of pamphlets. So things like why we should nationalize the coal industry, why we should have a national health service, why the government should provide old age pensions, why there should be a minimum wage. So those kind of incremental steps. So as I said, they weren't Marxists. They didn't want government to seize control of everything right away, but they thought, because they didn't think that the problem was immiseration of the working classes the way the Marxists did. They actually looked at the world and said, no, workers are actually getting better off, but that means that we can afford more generous programs. So they were a little more sensible than Marxists, but still, that's what they were aiming at, as much socialism as they could get as soon as they could get it. Okay. In this environment, it was important to, Hayek thought, it was important to sort of rally the troops, meaning the few intellectuals, economists, historians, journalists, who weren't on board with central planning. And one of those was Walter Eucken. And I tell the story in the book of Eucken finding himself in a small town in Switzerland in 1948, eating an orange. And he's really, really enjoying the orange. And a number of people who see this comment on it. George Stigler, who was there, writes in a memoir of this meeting that Eucken was really enjoying that orange. Now, why was he enjoying it so much? He had spent the war in Nazi Germany. He was an anti-socialist, anti-Nazi economist, but nonetheless he had spent the war in Germany, was lucky not to have been arrested, and he had not had an orange for the duration of the war, because under the planning system that emerged, not through any real plan, but just through piecemeal growth, the overall government control of the economy in Nazi Germany, there were no oranges. Well, except if you were a high party official. There were no oranges in the stores. Right? Everything was directed toward the war effort. But I think that kind of capsulizes what can happen in a centrally planned economy if the worst people get on top. Eucken almost couldn't get out of Germany to go to this meeting because the Allied authorities were suspicious of any German who had served the war in Germany. But enough people wrote letters on Eucken's behalf to convince them that he was okay. He became important later as an advisor to the West German government, in particular to a character I'll talk about in a minute. But this meeting took place, so Hayek called together basically 36 academics and journalists to a small town in Switzerland. I'm not quite sure why he picked this hotel, but it was in a town called Montpelier. And they decided to name the group the Montpelier Society because they couldn't agree on any other name. And this one was kind of neutral. But here's Hayek at the bottom. I love the wallpaper, by the way. Here's Hayek speaking and other people listening. Here's Mises listening. This is Karl Popper and Mises. And on an excursion, there's Milton Friedman as a very young man, George Stigler, and Groucho Marx. No. That's Aaron Director, who edited the Journal of Law and Economics for a long time, also at the University of Chicago. So there are two, I guess you might call them case studies of different economic policy paths countries took after the war. And I picked two. One is Germany and the other is India. They took very different directions. So Germany finds itself after the war split up into different occupation zones. There's the map. The British zone and the US zone merged early on and became known as the Bi zone. And later the French zone merged with that and it became West Germany. This Soviet Union zone, of course, became East Germany. And then the little multicolored blotch in there is Berlin, which was split between East and West. This picture is from a movie which I recommend if you like depressing after-the-war movies called Germany Year Zero by the Italian director Roberto Rossellini, who is Isabella Rossellini's father. It was actually filmed in the rubble. This is post-war Berlin. This is the way it actually looked. And it's about this boy who's basically trying to scrounge up enough food to survive. And it's a matter of scrounging and bartering for it because the Allied authorities, this is kind of ironic, the Allied authorities continued the price controls and rationing system that the Nazis had in place during the war. It continued right after the war, but now under the administration of the occupying authorities. And in this effort, they were advised, of course the US had price controls during the war too. The US lifted them immediately after the war. But one of the chief price controllers in the US was an economist named John Kenneth Galbraith. And Galbraith was then sent to Germany to advise the post-war reconstruction. And his advice was, there's no chance in getting recovery by decontrol. What we need is wise planning. That's the only question. Well, fortunately, his advice wasn't taken. Ludwig Erhard was another German economist who had spent the war in Germany despite, hating everything the Nazis stood for. Erhard came very close to getting arrested because he had written up a plan about how to rebuild Germany after Germany lost the war. It was clear to him. But that was illegal. You weren't allowed to say that during the war, and you certainly weren't allowed to plan for what was coming after Germany lost. He was a friend of a politician named Karl Goerdeler, and Goerdeler was arrested for participating in a plot to assassinate Hitler. He's briefly shown Goerdeler is in the Tom Cruise movie Valkyrie, if you've seen that. It's actually not a bad movie about the plot to assassinate Hitler. So Erhard is from Bavaria in the south of Germany, and he volunteers to help after the war volunteers to the US authorities to help in the economic reconstruction. And they put him in charge of a small town, and he does well there. They put him in charge of the economic plans for Munich, and he does well there. They put him in charge of the entire buy zone. And it's kind of a fluke because he's a very free market economist, and that's not sort of the center of the political spectrum. He's affiliated with a very small fringe free market party called the Free Democrats, whereas the big parties are the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, who are left, center left and center right, but not really free market. But because the Christian Democrats were in a coalition with the Free Democrats, they said, okay, you can have the economic guy. So Erhard, just through the lucky circumstance, became the economic director. Now, on June 20th, 1948, he gets a phone call from General Lucius Clay, who's the head of the U.S. Occupation Authority. Erhard had planned a speech in coordination with Clay announcing the introduction of a new currency, because the currency in place during the war, the old Reichsmark, was pretty much lost all its value. So they were going to introduce the Deutsche Mark. And Clay calls up Erhard and says, people in my office tell me that you're not only going to announce that, but you're going to announce the decontrol of prices and the end of rationing for a lot of things. And we haven't approved that. And my advisors tell me you're making a big mistake. And Erhard says to Clay, that's okay, my advisors tell me I'm making a big mistake too. But I'm going to do it anyway. And he went ahead and did it, and it was an immediate success. Right? When they decontrolled the price of food, guess what happened? Suddenly food appeared in the stores. The farmers who had been hoarding things or selling them on the black market now brought them to market, to an open legal market. People who were there describe it as sort of an overnight transformation where suddenly the streets were filled with construction crews finally rebuilding things. Factories started to produce stuff. Suddenly the smokestacks were operating again. So it was a big success. And it ushered in a period known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or wonder economy. When West Germany was formed, Erhard became the economic minister. And under Konrad Adenauer, after about 12 or 13 years of that, he became the prime minister for a few years. So he was very popular because the economy was doing so well. So a big turn to the market and a big success story. And one emblem of that, of course, became the Volkswagen. I was pleased that when I flew into DTW today, they rented me a Volkswagen Beetle, the new version, right? Which is technically a much better car than this. But it was a great car, great cheap car for its day. Now in India, they did something very different. So this cartoon takes a little deciphering. Here's Gandhi, who has led the independence movement, just ascending the rope into cloud cuckoo land, meaning his ideas about how to actually run the economy were a bit of fanciful, let's say, wishful thinking, dreamy. He objected, naturally enough, to the way the British had exploited India under the mercantilist system of rule. Right? So everything was being taxed, that all the international trade was being taxed, and India was being underpaid for the raw materials that Britain was buying because they were the only customer that was allowed to buy it, and so on. And Gandhi's solution to being exploited in that way by mercantilism was, let's abolish international trade. So let's produce everything we can in India and not import anything. Now, that's what I wrote in the first draft, but an Indian economist emailed me who had seen this and said, that's not quite right. And he directed me to an essay in which Gandhi said, no, I'm not against all international trade. If there's something that India can't possibly produce, it's okay to import it. So he was kind of a moderate. He was willing to import oatmeal because they couldn't grow that in India. But other than that, right? So, and his idea of localism wasn't just nationwide, it was actually village-wide. At the village level, he wanted each village to spin its own cloth. And his symbol became the spinner's wheel, right? Which was a kind of crude way to produce cloth compared to a factory. But he didn't govern. He turned the governing over to his lieutenants, and chief among them was Nehru. Nehru was the first prime minister of India, and Nehru was a socialist. And why was he a socialist? Well, he went to college at the University of Cambridge, where he heard lectures by George Bernard Shaw and John Maynard Keynes, and kind of was steeped in Fabian socialism. There's one part of his career where he became more of a Marxist. That's while he was in jail. But when he got out and had a real chance to become a political leader, he moved back toward sort of Fabian socialism. But he always admired the Soviet Union. So Gandhi's idea was to have a 5-year plan. And he hired a mathematician named Mahalanobis to come up with the plan for him. But he's arguing with some of his fellow members of the Congress Party here. This guy is Patel, who was more of a free marketeer. So they had a lot of arguments. Now, I actually start the chapter on India with the following story. The British economist of Hungarian extraction, Peter Bauer, who writes about development economics, comes to India in what year was it? 58, I believe it was. And he wants to meet B.R. Shenoy. And he knows about Shenoy because Shenoy is the author of something called the Note of Dissent on India's second 5-year plan. So the first 5-year plan wasn't too ambitious, but the second 5-year plan was big. So government was going to take over the allocation of all investment funds. And that's basically means they were going to steer the economy from then on. They put together a panel of economists to give them feedback on the plan, 21 economists. 20 of them said, yeah, it's a great idea. Shenoy said, no, it's a terrible idea. Shenoy had trained under Hayek at the LSE. All the others had trained at Oxford, Cambridge, other places, where they learned a top-down approach to development economics. So Bauer comes to India and he wants to meet Shenoy. He goes to the British High Commission, which no longer runs the country, but they're still, the British government is trying to help India. That's their intent anyway. So Bauer goes to the British High Commission and says, can one of you put me in touch with Professor Shenoy? I really want to talk to him. And Shenoy was so far on the outs. He was such an unwelcome person in this debate because he had taken this position nobody else was taking. He was considered a nuisance and a thorn by Nehru, by Mahalanobis, by all the Western advisors who were saying, yeah, central planning is the way to develop. And so a bureaucrat at the British High Commission says to Bauer, we don't have any time for acknowledged madmen. Right? We don't know where this guy is, he's crazy. We're not going to put you in touch with him. And Shenoy said later, Bauer said, writing a tribute to Shenoy, I run into a lot of arrogant bureaucrats in my day, but this guy took the cake. Right, but the advice they were getting was pretty much, from the West, pretty much in favor of this approach to planning. Right? That was development economics. To develop, you need more capital, and to get more capital, you need to, well, Western aid, basically, is the way you get more capital. But if you want to grow, you need to have heavy industry. And this is kind of crazy in a country whose comparative advantage is agriculture. And that was Shenoy's point. He said, look, capital is scarce in India. It's crazy to build steel mills. He harked back to Adam Smith's basic idea that it's crazy to make it yourself when you can buy it more cheaply. Right? If you're a butcher, you don't try to sew your own clothes. Right? Specialize in what you have a comparative advantage at and buy everything else. So that was Shenoy's very simple advice. But most of the Western economists who came to advise India, and there's a long list of them, but here are some of the more famous ones. Galbraith, of course. Galbraith keeps showing up in my book at the right place with the wrong ideas. So he just keeps coming back. Galbraith was actually ambassador to India under the Kennedy administration. He went around the country giving lectures on how to develop. And it's like the German experience never happened. He says the same thing. Oh, there's no chance of getting development by decontrol and by market leading things. No, if you leave it to the market, there's a big danger that nothing will happen. Well, they didn't leave it to the market, and nothing happened. India had very slow growth until they started to decontrol the economy in the late 80s, early 90s. But among this group of advisors are many future Nobel laureates. The last one is Myrdal, who shared the Nobel Prize with Hayek, which made both of them unhappy. There were only two Western advisors who dissented. One was Bauer, who I mentioned earlier, and Milton Friedman. In the 50s, the Eisenhower administration sort of got wind that all the advice being given was not really Republican advice. And they sent Milton Friedman, and Friedman wrote a memo, which is worth reading even to this day, saying, when capital is scarce, it's foolish to build heavy industries and then starve the rest of the economy. So instead of having steel mills and then having cloth produced by hand looms, because you can't afford weaving factories anymore because all the capital has gone to making steel, why not let the market allocate it to where it's most productive? And it's more likely that you'll have maybe some light industry and a lot of agriculture, but not heavy industry. So you can't grow faster by wasting resources. But the Indian economists, as I've already suggested by talking about the committee, 20 out of 21 favored the plan, wasn't much better because, especially the younger economists, they'd all been trained by the guys we just saw on the last slide, the guys and the lady, Joan Robinson. So here's Wadi, who's a famous Indian economist who now teaches in the US at Columbia University, describing the training he got. And so this is sort of an important lesson in how ideas are transmitted and how academics and intellectuals can have an influence, maybe a generation later, but on actual policy making. Ideas do matter. Economists like me and Amartya Sen. Sen is a Nobel laureate, and you have to know the history here. Bhagwati is kind of poking him here because Sen is sort of not really made the turn to free market economics the way Bhagwati has. We came back from the West after studying at Cambridge, Oxford, LSE, trained in a left-wing tradition. Our teachers had been radical or progressive economists from a little left of center to all the way to the left. with luminaries such as Nikki Calder and Joan Robinson. Joan Robinson was a Maoist, so I think you can fairly say that that's about as far to the left as you can get. Now, when we returned to India with this training, we were programmed. He's suggesting, you know, we hadn't really thought it through ourselves. We were just stuffed with this idea and we believed it. Programmed to endorse all kinds of interventions. And so Indian economists came in, and who did they work for? They worked for the Planning Commission, or they worked for the Indian Statistical Institute, which was an adjunct to the Planning Commission. Wadi's important in this story because he's one of the first Indian economists who looks at the data. After a couple of decades of very sluggish growth, around 1970, he starts publishing books saying, this isn't working, right? Look outside of India. Look at South Korea. South Korea has gone from our level of poverty to a multiple of our level of income. So maybe we need to start letting market forces allocate resources more efficiently. But instead, the planning system was sort of the most bureaucratic planning system you can imagine. It was called the permit Raj, because Raj meaning regime. That was, when the British ruled, they called it the British Raj. Now it's the permit Raj. People who give permits now run the system. So you have to get permission to do anything. And it's so crazy if you're trying to grow the economy that you had to get permission if you wanted to hire more people. You had to get permission if you wanted to install more machines in your factory or increase your output. Under the plan, every firm got a quota. You were supposed to produce this much and no more, and no less, but no more. So as you can imagine, any business that wanted to expand had to spend months and months submitting applications and getting things approved and stamped and running from one bureaucracy to another. One Indian businessman, Gurcharan Das, published a book called India Unchained, in which he worked for Procter & Gamble in India. And he said that it was a nightmare. We had to hire people just to carry our paperwork and push it through and pay who needed to be paid in order to get things permitted. But when you have this kind of system where you have to buy permission for everything, there's a lot of opportunities for people to collect bribes. And the whole system became riddled with a great amount of corruption. And India is still struggling with corruption that's endemic to the system of everything needing a permit. They began to decontrol in the late 1980s. There was a big bang in 1991. And since then, it's gotten more and more free, and India has started growing at very rapid rates. It's slowed down a little since the global financial crisis, but almost, not quite Chinese rates, but up there, 7–8% a year. So finally lifting, a billion people out of poverty. I mean, the most important event in, the post-war period maybe, and the most remarkable thing that's very seldom talked about is how much inequality in the world as a whole has gone down because a middle class has emerged in India and China. Those two countries together is a big fraction of world population. And the amount of, the increase in living standards in those two countries has been quite remarkable as a result of putting more reliance on market forces. Well, switching gears, let's talk about monetary policy in the post-war period. We're off the gold standard. This used to be included in Monopoly, by the way. It's a little outdated, you don't get it anymore. At the big post-war monetary conference to decide how to work a world system without the classical gold standard is held at Bretton Woods. And the reason they want to do it without the classical gold standard is that they've been listening to Keynes. And Keynes says, no, you want a more discretionary monetary policy. So you want more freedom for central bankers to stimulate the economy. Keynes is the leader of the British delegation to Bretton Woods conference. Harry Dexter White, no relation, is the leader of the US delegation. The US is calling the shots because every country in Europe owes the US money after World War II. There's a famous ditty that circulated among the British who resented the fact that the US was calling the shots. It goes like this. The British ambassador to Washington was Lord Halifax. In Washington, Lord Halifax whispered to Lord Keynes, "They may have all the money bags, but we have all the brains." So they put Keynes in charge of the committee that created the World Bank. That was regarded as not as important as the IMF, which was the committee that Harry Dexter White ran. But Keynes was kind of the star of the conference. I mean, everybody knew him. He was a little worn physically, but he was still sharp. I tell a story in the book about White had a press conference every day to try to sell the idea to the US press, because the Congress was going to have to ratify the treaty creating the IMF and chip in most of the money to create the IMF. And one day Keynes comes to the press conference and to talk to the reporters, and the reporters are sort of hanging on his every word. And what does Keynes tell them? He tells them, our job here at this conference is to dethrone the ruthless monarch that is the gold standard and put constitutional constraints on it, which is a pretty bold way of describing things in the terms that are the opposite of the truth, because the gold standard had been a constitutional constraint on governments. It restrained how much money they could print, how much money they could spend and borrow. But to Keynes, that's the beastly thing, that it's restraining governments. We need to liberate governments, so we need to dethrone the gold standard. Keynes wants to dethrone it entirely. The compromise they reach is the US dollar will still be redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce, but every other currency in the world will be redeemable for US dollars. So that way we get by with less gold, and there's more leeway for national central banks to pursue Keynesian policies. Well, how'd that work out? Here's Richard Nixon in 1971 announcing the end of Bretton Woods. Now, you might think, well, that's not too bad. It lasted for 25 years. Well, not quite. I mean, there were three incompatible things they tried to do under Bretton Woods. One is to have fixed exchange rates. Two is to let every central bank do whatever it wanted in terms of monetary policy. And the only way you can make those two things compatible is not let people trade all the dollars for foreign currency or foreign currency for dollars that they want. Right? Because if your country is inflating faster than the US and your currency is losing purchasing power faster than the dollar, but the exchange rate is fixed, then now you can get a lot more purchasing power by swapping for dollars than you have if you stay with your own currency. Well, in that case, everybody's going to go to the central bank and demand dollars, and the central bank's going to run out of dollars. And that was a problem. Britain devalued, other countries devalued. One way to stop that is to say, no, you can't have dollars. Sorry, we have exchange controls. And in the early years of Bretton Woods, that's what they did. Right? So, okay, they could keep fixed exchange rates, but the exchange rates were kind of a fiction because you couldn't actually get dollars at the fixed exchange rate. When they started to lift exchange controls, then it fell apart. There was a series of exchange rate crises with devaluations, as I mentioned. Finally, the US has to leave Bretton Woods because, remember, the dollar was still redeemable for gold, but the US printed more dollars than was consistent with redeeming them all for gold. So Nixon came on TV, and of course he didn't blame US policy of flooding the world with dollars for the fact that we were running out of gold reserves. Who do you think he blamed? Speculators. Nasty speculators are attacking the dollar. Well, actually, the only people who could get gold were the foreign central banks. And there was one country in particular that was making trouble for the US, one European country in particular. Can you guess who? Being all, we want our gold.
Switzerland?
Oh, no, not Switzerland. Switzerland, the Swiss are polite. Who makes trouble for the US in Europe? France, thank you. You got it. And the US said, as they've been saying to other countries, well, look, you can have your gold, but, you know, we're providing NATO, so... And France said, that's okay, we'll leave NATO. And they did. One of the people who advised Nixon to do this was Milton Friedman. right? Because Friedman thought we could have a better managed money if we do it on a fiat money system. Under a gold standard, you have these kind of extraneous constraints. Money flows in, money flows out. The central bank can't perfectly control the quantity of money. Let's get rid of that and just have a rational system of controlling the quantity of money. We can have better performance than we have, less inflation than we had under the gold standard. Yeah, that didn't work out either, but he was hopeful. Nixon appoints Arthur Burns to run the Fed, and Burns was actually Friedman's undergraduate teacher, so Friedman was enthusiastic. Burns is going to do the right thing. He knows how to control inflation by controlling the money supply. Burns gets chairmanship of the Fed, and he immediately starts giving speeches about how, well, inflation is due to labor unions, and inflation is due to too much demand driving up prices, and it's due to rigidities and monopolies, and he had every explanation under the book except he was printing too much money. And Friedman now had to choose, do I stay friends with Burns or do I tell the truth? He told the truth. He started attacking Burns in his Newsweek column at the American Economics Association meetings, and they were never friends again. Kind of sad, but Burns deserved it. I'm going to skip this one because we're running out of time. So the last chapter deals with the really big question of how we got into such of a debt mess. So the chapter before that deals with the growth of government, but I'm skipping that. And that one's on free trade. I'm skipping that. Okay. So here's a Greek economist named George Tavlis who comes to the Cato Institute in 2010. I was there to give a talk. And he begins his talk by saying, yeah, it's great to be back in the US. You know, more than ever, it reminds me of home. Yeah, well, you got the joke better than they did at Cato. He said, let me be clear. What I'm saying is your debt situation is looking more and more like Greece. So let's review a little what happened in Europe. Greece had the beginning of its crisis in 2009 when interest rates on Greek debt shot up. And at that point, the debt was 113% of GDP, and the budget deficit was more than 13% of GDP. But two-year bonds started paying 12% because bondholders said this can't go on. I mean, they're not going to have the money to pay us back, so these are now very risky bonds. Ireland had a crisis the following year. In Ireland, it was much more sudden. I mean, Greece had been running big deficits for years. In Ireland, it happened because the financial crisis made three of their largest banks insolvent, and even though the banks weren't fully insured, the government said, well, we'll pay everybody. And when they paid everybody, the budget deficit became 31% of GDP. I mean, that's 3 times as large as even the worst deficit we've had here. And the debt, which had been 25% after a few years of that, shot up to 97%. And markets said, that's not a sustainable path. These bonds are not going to be paid back, or there's a big risk they're not going to be paid back. And they started paying high interest rates. So how are we doing in the US? Here's the US gross federal debt as a percent of GDP. There are different measures of the debt. There's the debt held by the public, which doesn't include any of the implicit liabilities of Social Security and so on. This one includes a little bit of that, so it's a little more accurate. If you wanted to, so where is it now? Well, let's review the post-war period. So after World War II, we had a huge debt, more than 100% of GDP, but through economic growth and inflation, the real value of that fell down to about 30% of GDP. Right, so imagine having a credit card debt that's about 3 months' worth of income. It's not good, but it's better than 100%. Then the debt to GDP ratio starts to rise through the 80s. Again, it's a bipartisan effort. It actually declines a little bit in the 90s because the economy is growing at a rapid clip, and the logjam, the deadlock between Clinton and Newt Gingrich means that there aren't any ambitious new spending programs. 2001, all Republican Congress, it starts to grow again. And then in the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, it takes off like a rocket. I mean, this is completely unprecedented. And the recession officially ended in 2009. It's still taking off like a rocket. You might see some slight amount of flagging in the trajectory. Right? But there were 3 years of basically 10% deficits. This year it's going to be like 6 or 7%. So slight improvement. But as long as the debt is a larger percentage of GDP than the growth of the economy, so if the economy is growing at 2% or 3%, and the debt is growing at more than 3%, you're going to have a rising ratio, which means more and more debt relative to the ability to pay it back. So if you look at that trajectory and figure, well, 6% deficits for the next few years, we're only about 3 years behind Greece. We'll hit 113% of GDP in about 2016, 2015. What will markets do then? Well, we've already had one small downgrade in our debt rating, but it hasn't really hit yet. I mean, the Treasury is still paying very low interest rates. How long will that go on? When it stops going on, when the world says we've got enough treasuries, thank you, unless you start paying positive rates of return on them, the U.S. is going to have to pay more interest, and debt service will start to consume a bigger share of the federal budget. So what lies behind this willingness to take on debt? I blame it partly on fiscal Keynesianism. And here's a typical statement from a textbook that I had to read when I was in college. What about debt incurred during periods of unemployment? Resources would have been idle, so no other outputs are foregone. Right? That's a pretty remarkable statement. So if the government borrows money and spends it, it's a free lunch, because the people they hire otherwise would have just been sitting around the house. And the machines they use apparently just would have been sitting around in the corner of the factory collecting dust. So no other outputs are foregone. In fact, output is likely to be increased by the multiplier effects of the initial spending. So not only does the government get to spend, but the private sector also grows. It's a free lunch with a free dessert. The creation of debt raises output and is likely to raise investment in the total growth of the economy. And if you want to see this argument on steroids, read Paul Krugman's columns. So, better than a free lunch at anything less than full employment. Now, at full employment, if you consume more today, you have to consume less tomorrow or less of something else. But not at less than full employment. Well, how often are you at full employment? In the Keynesian view, hardly ever. You're almost always below full employment. So it's almost always a free lunch. And that kind of intellectual view, and the great book on this topic is Democracy in Deficit by Buchanan and Wagner. That kind of view sort of gave a license to politicians to say, look, it's free if you finance it by debt rather than taxes. So why would you tax? And so the U.S. had chronic deficits for many years as a result of that way of thinking. Now we've got acute deficits. But the road was paved by this view that made deficits entirely, not only innocuous, positive things. Now, there's a difference between the private incentive to take on debt and the public incentive. So, Randy Marsh buys his family a $200 blender. I don't know if you've seen this episode. It's the best short explanation of the financial crisis, I think, available. He buys his family a blender they can't afford. It's $200. So they got a family debt of $200. And Stan tries to go back to the store and return it, and the store can't return it because they've taken this IOU and sold it downstream, and it's been collateralized and securitized, and they can't unbundle it. But here's the public debt. As of, not last week, but last month, I guess. Gross federal debt, the same thing I showed you earlier, amounts to $51,504 per citizen. Me, you. Per taxpayer, it's even higher. But not everybody in a family of four is a taxpayer. But if you break it down to a family of four, that's more than 1,000 Margaritaville blenders per family of four the government has bought on your behalf. Right? And not paid for, but gone into debt for. So Okay, Randy is irresponsible, but Randy's representative in the Congress is even more irresponsible. So how do we put a stop to that? So this is my last slide. So this is Thomas Sargent before he won the Nobel Prize, and I keep waiting for him to say this again, but he's been much less enthusiastic about talking about politics since he got the prize. Anyway, here's what he said in an interview in 2010. It was actually in the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis newsletter. And he said, well, think about the gold standard. Right? Under the gold standard, there was no law that restricted your debt to GDP ratio. Right? So there wasn't a balanced budget amendment or anything like that. But feasibility and credit markets did the job. What does that mean? If you want to borrow money on the gold standard, people who lend it to you have to think, can they pay it back? Well, it's gold. They can't just print the gold to pay us back. They're actually going to have to be committed to having more revenue than expenditures at some point in the future so that they can pay back the debt. Right? So that's what he means by balancing your budget in a present value sense. If you're borrowing today, you have to be planning surpluses for tomorrow. So not every year do you balance the budget, but you have to balance it over time in the long run. Right? So that restricted the indebtedness of governments because markets wouldn't buy unlimited amounts of their debt when it was clear that there was a default risk because nobody could print gold. And I think that's actually kind of a charming feature of the gold standard. Now, why didn't that work in Europe? Right? Greece doesn't print its own money. Greece is on the euro. So why didn't credit markets say, oh, Greece, you're borrowing too many euros, you're not going to be able to pay it back? Why didn't they do that sooner? They eventually woke up to that. But why didn't they do it sooner? I think it's because they thought the European Union or the European Central Bank was going to bail Greece out. And for a while it looked like they were, right? But it turned out they couldn't afford it. So Greek bondholders took a 50% haircut. That's a default. But the gold standard didn't have any bailout mechanism like that, so there was no moral hazard problem, to use the technical term. Whereas under the European Central Bank and the EU, there was a big moral hazard problem. The day Greece joined the European Central Bank, well, practically the day, the interest rate on Greek bonds fell to just a few points above the interest rate on German bonds, which in retrospect was craziness, unless you thought there was nearly 100% chance of Greece being bailed out, which turned out to be an overestimate. So fortunately, some of those people who bought those bonds took a burn. But for the US, we do print our own money. So there's no danger of default in the sense of holders of US Treasuries not getting the dollars they have coming. The risk is that the dollars won't buy anything by the time they get paid. So there is an inflation risk. And I think that's what the debt downgrade was about. So we need something like the gold standard to restrain fiscal authorities so that the market doesn't have this illusion that US Treasury debt is risk-free. And I guess one more picture to show you. What happens if we don't get our house in order? We end up printing enough money to pay everybody back and the value goes to zero. Actually, the currency would have more and more zeros on it. It's the purchasing power that would head towards zero. So in case I said anything controversial, I will take questions.
To India's dominion status.
Okay.
Churchill, we'll go there, was one of the foremost advocates of maintaining India as a colony, but at the same time he was an ardent free trader. So how does that fit with Britain exploiting India in a mercantilistic paradigm?
Well, it's possible that he advocated a more free trade policy toward India, but that's not what was followed. I mean, it wasn't as bad in the 30s and 40s as it had been under the East India Company. Right? There it was sort of almost outright plunder. But India as a colony was part of the Commonwealth, well, as sort of a junior member of the Commonwealth. But yeah, I'd have to look more into the details to know what kind of tariffs they were paying, but there were sort of British controls on what they could do that were working to the disadvantage of India, but working to the advantage of British merchants who got to do the trading between India and the rest of the world. So it was a mercantilist system. So maybe Churchill wanted to make it more of a free trade system, and that would have been better for India, certainly. But I mean, there's a big temptation, if it's a colony, to put more weight on what British merchants want than on what Indian consumers want. That's a problem. I recommend very heavily what Adam Smith had to say about colonies, which was that they're a complete waste from the point of view of the colonizer. Yeah.
Do you see any likelihood, or what would need to actually happen to get some sort of gold standard back in the U.S.?
That's a very involved question. I found the lecture hall by following a car with a Ron Paul bumper sticker. And I actually testified for Ron Paul's subcommittee before he left the Congress. It was last fall. And he had a bill called the Monetary Freedom Act, which was an attempt to sort of let the gold standard in the back door by taking away taxes that discriminate against gold. Like you have to pay capital gains tax if you buy gold and the dollar falls against gold. Right? That's considered a profit from holding gold. It's worth more dollars. Legalized the private minting of gold and silver coins. I don't know if some of you followed the case of the guy who was convicted of violating a federal statute which said not allowed to mint your own coins. And leveling the playing field on legal tender status, not giving Federal Reserve notes legal tender status anymore. So if people wanted to, with those barriers removed, they could put themselves on the gold standard, which I don't expect a lot of people would do until the dollar starts to inflate, until the purchasing power of the dollar starts to fall dramatically. And we have seen in many countries around the world, especially Latin America, that if inflation gets 20% a year, 50% a year, when they start measuring it per month, you know you're in trouble. Putting themselves on another monetary standard, dollarizing in Latin America. So, you know, the technology is there, and there are online vendors who will sell you a gold-denominated bank account. One of them was recently busted for operating a money transfer service without the proper post-9/11 licenses. So the feds are acting like they're worried about competition, but if we could get them to allow competition, it's possible that we would have this alternative in place, and as the dollar becomes less reliable, people move more of their transactions into gold or silver or Swiss francs or something. The other way to do it is sort of a frontal assault and, you know, get the dollar relinked to gold, which is going to take a lot more congressmen like Ron Paul than we currently have, right? So there's just no consensus for it. Right now, the battle is sort of within the free market wing of the Republican Party. Do we stand for a gold? Do they, I should say, stand for a gold standard? And during the primary season, there were some favorable noises made by people other than Ron Paul. Never by Romney, who got the nomination. But to make it something that could actually pass Congress, there's got to be wider support than that. But it's an idea that we need to sort of think about as a possibility and have ready on the shelf should the dollar become a lot less stable. And I mean, in practical terms, I hate to hope for hyperinflation, but that's the kind of crisis that would bring it about. Make it sort of politically palatable that something drastic has to be done. Yeah?
Do you think quantitative easing is going to bring that about? And how prevalent do you think Fabian economics is, or some similarity in
Yeah.
economic thought to that. How prevalent do you think that is today as compared to just after World War II?
Okay. Quantitative easing is a package deal. It's not just the tripling of the Fed's balance sheet, but the Fed at the same time is paying banks for the first time to hold reserves. So the growth in the monetary base, right, the thing that's tripled, isn't quite mirrored in the amount of money the public holds, M1 or M2. Those have grown actually at fairly moderate rates, and inflation therefore has stayed moderate. Now, it is an odd situation to have banks suddenly sitting on trillions, literally trillions in excess reserves. And as inflation does start to rise, and Bernanke is signaling that he's going to let it rise somewhat, he claims he'll put the brakes on if it hits 2.5. That's easier said than done. So where was I going with that? I forget.
3 phases to quantitative easing.
3 phases, right. So they've sort of sterilized the effect on the money supply. So the problem is, as inflation goes up, they're going to have to pay higher and higher interest to banks to get them to hold the reserves. And at some point, the Fed starts to lose money. So it remains to be seen whether they're willing to go there. But there are people within the Fed who say this is crazy, we've got to back out of this situation. But it's always next period, next quarter, the economy will be better. What was your second question?
How prevalent?
Oh, how prevalent is Fabian thinking? Well, socialism in the sense of wanting the government to own everything is not as popular as it used to be. There are exceptions, but Obamacare isn't sort of outright government owns all the hospitals the way National Health Service was in Britain. It's more monkeying with the market, forcing people to buy this, taxing them for buying that, eliminating the option to do something else, right? But those, that's sort of the favored method of interventionists now, is to monkey with taxes and subsidies rather than either central planning or price controls or outright prohibitions, although there are price controls sort of hidden subtly in parts of the Affordable Care Act. So, yeah, I think there's been, I don't know if you want to call it progress on that front, but although government isn't buying industries anymore, nationalizing industries, government as a share of the economy does continue to grow, and that's a real problem. And Milton Friedman once said, we may have won the intellectual battle, but you don't see it. You don't see the share of government spending as a percent of GDP going down yet. That's when we know that we've actually had some impact.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wright. If you guys would like to join us in AJ's for the Afterglow, we'll be making our way there right now. So we'll see you there. And thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you.